It's one of those profound moments in life when an unexpected memory jolts us awake, forcing us to confront the deep, unspoken debt we owe to the people who quietly shape our destiny. For Elvis Presley, this awakening came in the form of a yellowed hospital bill found on a crisp December morning in 1975. A bill in itself hardly remarkable, but attached to it was a note that would forever change the way Elvis saw his past, his life, and the true meaning of gratitude. The note, written by his mother Gladys, contained a revelation that would haunt and inspire him in equal measure, the nurse who had saved his life as a baby, the woman who against all odds had refused to give up when his life hung by a thread. Elvis had never known this story, never known how close he had come to death in the first hours of his life, or that it was a determined nurse named Dorothy May Williams who had fought through the night to breathe life back into his fragile body. Her relentless efforts defied the doctors who had given up hope. This moment, finding the note, reading those words, and learning of his miraculous survival, was not just about learning the details of an old story. It was about a deep, emotional reckoning for Elvis. It was as though he had always known that his life was bigger than fame or fortune. But now, more than ever, he understood that it had been gifted to him through the hands of another. The realization was overwhelming. His music, his stardom, none of it would have existed if not for that night in a small hospital in Tupelo, where a nurse refused to let him die. This is the moment that sparked Elvis's journey of rediscovery, a mission to find the woman who had given him life and to repay her for what she had done, a mission that would forever change both of their lives. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was a man used to being in control, yet in the face of this revelation, he found himself powerless. Fame, wealth, and adoration from millions of fans all seemed insignificant in comparison to the weight of the truth that now rested in his hands. He was alive because of one woman, a nurse who had refused to surrender when the doctors had, and who had worked tirelessly to bring him back when his heart had stopped beating twice. In the quiet of his study at Graceland, surrounded by family photos and old documents, Elvis could feel the weight of his mother's words. The realization hit him with a quiet, piercing intensity. He owed his life to Dorothy May Williams. It wasn't just a matter of fate. It was the result of one woman's determination, one person's refusal to give up on him. And yet, this act of kindness had been hidden away for decades, buried in the corners of his memories and unspoken in the family's conversations. He felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. How had he never known this? He had always been told that his life was meant for greatness, that he was destined for stardom, but he had never been told the truth about his first battle against death itself. The vulnerability of this realization was something Elvis had never experienced before. He had always been the man with the answers, the performer who understood the power of his voice, his presence. But in this moment he was just a man, standing face to face with his own fragile humanity. As a child, Elvis had been raised with love and adoration, surrounded by the comforts of a middle-class home, but there was always something beneath the surface, an undercurrent of loneliness. Despite the crowds that surrounded him, he often found himself isolated, searching for something deeper, something real that he could hold on to. Fame had brought him everything he had ever dreamed of, but it had also brought its own burdens, the constant pressure to be perfect, the expectation to be a symbol of strength, to be something more than human. This was something he couldn't escape. No matter how many records he sold, or how many adoring fans shouted his name, he had spent his entire life fighting for something he had not fully understood, a desire to be seen, to be acknowledged, to matter. But now, as he sat there in the quiet of his study, he realized the irony. His life had mattered long before any of that. It had mattered because one woman, with a heart full of compassion and faith, had fought to save him. Elvis wasn't just a star. He was someone who had been given a second chance, someone whose life had been touched by a divine intervention, even if he hadn't known it at the time. The enormity of that realization was enough to make him want to find Dorothy May Williams, not just to thank her but to understand her, to know what kind of person could give so much of themselves for the life of a stranger. He needed to understand how someone like that could remain so humble, so dedicated, and yet never seek recognition. With a newfound sense of purpose, Elvis made a decision. He couldn't just let this story slip by unnoticed. He had to find her. He had to meet the woman who had saved his life. And he knew that no matter what, he would do something for her. Something that would honor her sacrifice, her compassion, and the gift she had given him. But as he began to investigate, the trail grew colder, and the answers more elusive. Little did he know, this search would lead him on a journey that would not only reunite him with the woman who had given him life, but change him forever. Elvis's search for Dorothy May Williams quickly became an obsession. What had started as a single, heartfelt desire to find the woman who had saved him transformed into a relentless mission. Using his connections, he enlisted the help of a private investigator. But the trail was not an easy one to follow. Dorothy May's records were sparse, scattered, and many of the small-town hospital's files had long been destroyed. The years had eroded any trace of the woman who had given Elvis the most precious gift of all, life. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The investigator had to follow several dead ends, retracing the years of Dorothy May's life with painstaking care. But eventually, a breakthrough came. The nurse, now 78, was living alone in Jackson, Mississippi, far from the bustling streets of Memphis. Her humble life had been spent caring for others, but now, in her retirement, she lived quietly, struggling to make ends meet. The news struck Elvis like a thunderclap. He was both relieved and heartbroken. Relieved that she was alive, but heartbroken that the woman who had saved him was now living in near obscurity. Her years of service largely forgotten by the world. Elvis didn't hesitate. He made plans to visit her in person, determined to meet the woman who had given him life. But there was something else pulling at him. Anxiety, excitement, and a sense of responsibility. How do you thank someone for the gift of life itself? How do you express gratitude to a stranger who had become more than family, more than just a nurse? The enormity of it weighed heavily on him. On that sunny May morning in 1976, Elvis, accompanied only by his longtime friend and bodyguard Red West, drove to Jackson. The drive was quiet, save for the hum of the car's engine and the occasional passing of the landscape. Elvis couldn't help but reflect on the peculiar nature of fame, the way it had shaped his life, but how, in moments like these, it felt so irrelevant. Fame had never made him feel more vulnerable than in this moment. It was as if all the wealth, the adulation, the endless applause couldn't prepare him for the simple, raw act of saying thank you to someone who had without hesitation chosen him over everything else. When they arrived at the modest apartment complex, Elvis felt a wave of nerves flood over him. Despite his years of performing in front of thousands, he felt exposed, uncertain. As they walked toward her apartment, the world seemed to shrink around him. The hallways were quiet, almost too still. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears as he approached the door of the woman who had, so many years ago, saved his life. And then, there she was. Dorothy May Williams, 78 years old, tending to her small garden outside her apartment. Even with the baseball cap and sunglasses, Elvis's identity was unmistakable. Her sharp eyes immediately recognized him, and the moment she did, the world seemed to stop. Her gardening spade fell from her hands, and all she could manage was a breathless, "Oh my stars." Elvis stepped forward, his voice soft, yet full of respect. "Yes, ma'am. Miss Dorothy May Williams?" he asked. The nurse stood frozen, her hands trembling as recognition set in. This was no ordinary visitor. This was the man whose life she had saved so long ago. The man whose music had become the soundtrack to the world. Yet to him, she was the person who had given him life. In that moment, Elvis could sense the weight of history between them. His words, soft and gentle, carried the weight of a lifetime. "I recently learned something about you and me that I think you might remember better than I do," he said. His voice quivered slightly, betraying the depth of his emotion. The nurse's eyes welled with tears as the pieces of the past clicked into place. "The baby," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The little baby who wouldn't breathe." There was no need for more words. The connection between them was instant, profound, and undeniable. This was no longer a chance encounter. It was the culmination of decades of gratitude, pain, and healing that had been waiting to find its way to the surface. Elvis gently took Dorothy May Sepp's hands in his own, his voice now steady with a deep sense of reverence. "Miss Dorothy May, would you mind if I sat with you for a while? I Sepp'd love to hear about that night, and I have some things I Sepp'd like to say to you." It was an invitation that seemed simple enough on the surface, but it held a weight of emotion, one that both of them had carried in silence for years. The two of them sat together, not as star and fan, not as celebrity and nurse, but as two souls brought together by fate. As Dorothy May began to speak, Elvis listened intently, his heart breaking, as she relayed the details of the night that had forever changed their lives. As Dorothy May spoke, the memories of that fateful night came flooding back. The small hospital in Tupelo was far from equipped to handle a crisis of this magnitude. The staff was overworked, the resources scarce, and yet in the midst of the chaos, Dorothy May had stood as a beacon of hope. She described the moment vividly. How Elvis, so tiny, had stopped breathing. How the doctors had declared that there was nothing more they could do. But she didn't listen. She couldn't. Something deep inside her refused to let go of the tiny life in front of her. She worked tirelessly, breath by breath, her hands working feverishly. "Your mama cried so hard when you started breathing again," Dorothy May recalled, her voice trembling. "She kept saying the thank you. Thank you, did it. And I told her what I told all my mothers, did it. Thank me, honey. Thank the good Lord. I set them just his hands." Elvis listened, his heart heavy as the weight of those words settled on him. He had always known that there was something special about music, that it had the power to heal, to connect, to uplift. But hearing this story, hearing how his survival was the result of someone else's unwavering faith, changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. This was no ordinary act of kindness. It was the act of someone who had seen the value of every life, no matter how small, and had chosen to fight for it. For the first time in his life, Elvis began to understand the true power of connection, how every action, no matter how seemingly insignificant, could ripple out and affect the lives of others in ways unimaginable. In that moment, sitting on that porch with Dorothy May, he realized that he wasn't just a man who performed for millions. He was part of a much larger story, one that had begun long before the music, the fame, or the bright lights. It had begun with the hands of a nurse, who had saved a life when no one else believed it could be saved. "Miss Dorothy May," Elvis said softly, his voice choked with emotion, "I spent my whole life not knowing about that night, not knowing about you. But now that I do, I have to ask, how can I possibly thank someone for the gift of life itself?" Dorothy May smiled through her tears, her hands shaking as she wiped her eyes. "Honey, seeing you here, seeing the man you become, that sips thanks enough for me." But Elvis wasn't satisfied. He couldn't let it end there. This woman who had saved his life deserved more than just his gratitude. She deserved a life of comfort, a life that honored her selflessness and devotion, and Elvis was determined to provide it. With deep reverence, he said, "Mom, with your permission, I like to do something to honor you, to make sure you comfortable for the rest of your days. Would you allow me to do that?" Dorothy May, though overwhelmed by emotion, nodded, the tears flowing freely now. She had never expected anything in return. She had simply done what she believed was right. But here, in this moment, she realized that the man she had helped so many years ago was giving back in ways she could never have imagined. Elvis left that day with a promise to honor Dorothy May's legacy. He knew that the journey wasn't over, that there was still more he could do for her, and for the countless others whose lives had been touched by her hands. And as he drove away from Jackson, he made plans to ensure that Dorothy May's story would never be forgotten. Not only had she saved his life, but now, with his help, she would touch the lives of countless others. The days that followed Elvis's visit to Dorothy May were filled with action and determination. He was not a man to let a moment of clarity slip away without doing something about it. The enormity of the realization that someone who had saved his life was now struggling was something he could not ignore. As a man who had lived his life in the public eye, surrounded by the trappings of fame and fortune, Elvis felt an urgent need to take action in a way that truly mattered, not just for himself, but for the woman who had given him everything. He immediately set to work, using his resources to change Dorothy May's life for the better. Elvis had always believed in the power of personal connections, and he understood that this one, his bond with Dorothy May, was a rare, precious thing that needed to be nurtured. The woman who had been there for him in his first moments of life would now be the one he helped in her later years. Within a week, Elvis had made arrangements to purchase a small house for Dorothy May on the outskirts of Jackson, a place she could call her own, a home that would provide her with the peace and comfort she had long deserved. While there's no official record of a foundation specifically named for her, Elvis made efforts to ensure she would never again have to worry about financial insecurity. These were not just gestures of wealth. They were symbols of something deeper, something more meaningful, a desire to give back in a way that reflected the deep gratitude he felt in his heart. The most touching gesture came about a month later. Elvis returned to Jackson with his entire band and a small film crew. He arranged for a private concert in Dorothy May's new backyard, just for her, her neighbors, and a few of her family members. It was an intimate gathering, yet one that was profoundly symbolic. For Elvis, it wasn't about the grandeur of the performance. It was about the quiet, tender moment of sharing his music with the woman who had, in a sense, given him the voice to sing. As the evening sun set over the small gathering, Elvis performed some of his greatest hits, but it was his rendition of How Great Thou Art that had the greatest emotional impact. Dorothy May's favorite hymn, sung by the man whose life she had saved, brought tears to her eyes. But it was the next song, the one he had written specifically for her, that truly brought the house down. Angel's Hands told the story of a nurse whose determination had saved a baby, and how that baby had gone on to change the world. It was a tribute to Dorothy May, but it was also a tribute to all the unsung heroes who quietly changed lives without ever seeking recognition. As Elvis sang the final notes, Dorothy May could no longer hold back her tears. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered emotion, a full-circle moment that captured the essence of who Elvis was at his core, a man deeply aware of the fragility of life and the power of empathy. The bond between Elvis Presley and Dorothy May Williams stands as a powerful testament to the profound impact one person can have on another's life. What began as a chance encounter in a small hospital in Tupelo, Mississippi, where a nurse refused to give up on a baby, grew into a lifelong relationship filled with respect, gratitude, and transformation. For Elvis, this connection became more than a story of survival. It became a story of recognition, empathy, and the lasting power of human connection. Throughout his life, Elvis had been celebrated as a symbol of fame, fortune, and success. Yet, in the quiet moments with Dorothy May, he discovered that the true measure of a person's worth was not found in the applause of millions, but in the simple, selfless acts of kindness that touch the lives of others. Dorothy May had never sought recognition, fame, or accolades. She had simply done her job, believing in the power of compassion and the importance of every life she touched. Through his acts of kindness, Elvis learned that the greatest gift we can give others is not just our material wealth or our fame, but the gift of love, understanding, and recognition. His connection with Dorothy May transcended the boundaries of celebrity and mortality, reminding us all that we are connected in ways we may never fully understand. Elvis's decision to honor her in such a meaningful way through the concert, the foundation, and the personal relationship they built was his way of saying thank you for the gift of life. It was his way of ensuring that Dorothy May's legacy would never be forgotten. As we reflect on their incredible story, we are reminded of the importance of recognizing those who help us along the way. How many people in our own lives have shaped us without ever asking for anything in return? Have we taken the time to thank them or recognize their impact? Take a moment today to reflect on those who have helped shape your journey. Whether it's a teacher, a mentor, or a friend, recognize the quiet heroes in your life. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on how empathy and kindness have shaped your own experiences. And if this story moved you, please share it with someone who might need a reminder that every act of kindness, no matter how small, can change the world. Elvis's journey of gratitude and connection reminds us that the true power of life lies in the relationships we build and the way we lift each other up, one act of kindness at a time.